Russia, Turkey and Iran have another go at Syria peace talks. Can diplomats devise a plan to end nearly 7 years of war? I'm Adnan Nawaz, and today's newsmaker is the Sochi peace talks. There's hope that after years of failed attempts to bring peace to Syria, the framework for a national unity government will be agreed in the Russian city of Sochi. Complicating what's already a tall task is the guest list. Out of the 1,700 invitations, the most noted no-show, well, that's the main opposition bloc called the High Negotiations Committee. The one important person who is there is Staffan de Mistura. The UN Special Envoy for Syria has been hosting peace talks for years, and while all so far have failed, Vladimir Putin says the event in Sochi is geared towards enhancing the UN's efforts. Natalie Pahonen has more.
For almost 7 years, Syrians have been swept up in war. And for almost 7 years, power brokers have tried to find a political solution. The emblem for the latest round of peace talks in Sochi includes a dove and an olive branch, universal symbols for peace. But the mix of players in the conflict, which includes Russia, Turkey, the United States, Iran, the Syrian regime and opposition forces, has made it difficult for everyone to sit at the same negotiating table and agree on a plan to end the fighting. At these talks arranged by Russia, Turkey and Iran, paving the way for a new Syrian constitution was meant to be on the agenda.
It's only the Syrian people who can write their future. The Syrian people have an important role. We have an important role, a mutual challenge.
More than 1,000 delegates had gathered in Sochi. But there was a noticeable absence. Official representatives of the Syrian High Negotiations Committee were not in the room. The talks were meant to last for 2 days, but have been cut back to just 1. While time is short for the attendees, the next generation of Syrians is already growing up fast and waiting for their first day of peace. Natalie Pahonen, The Newsmakers.
In a moment, we'll talk to Yahya al-Aridi, the spokesman for the Syrian Negotiations Commission, which represents the opposition to Bashar al-Assad. We're also joined by Sergei Makarov, director of the Institute for Political Studies in Russia. But first of all, let's get some context to all of this. TRT World's Andrew Hopkins is covering the talks in Sochi. Andrew, tell us who is there, but also, just as importantly, who isn't there?
Yeah, it's a real mixed bag, Adnan, with quite a few gaping holes in the attendees as well. We understand there were about 1,700 invitations sent out to delegates. We've no idea of exactly how many turned up. We have heard figures of about 1,000 bandied around, but there's been no official confirmation, and that does include delegates who are politicians or basically supporters of the Syrian regime, as well as parts of the opposition. Now, as far as the countries who are leading the Astana and Sochi process are concerned, Russia, Turkey and Iran, it's mainly lower-level ministers and high-level diplomats, although we have had an opening speech from the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who was actually heckled by protesters when that was taking place. However, absent are France and the UK. They were both invited as permanent members of the UN Security Council. They say they didn't want to come because these negotiations should be taking place through the UN at Geneva, and that's the case for the High Negotiations Committee as well. This is the main internationally recognized opposition negotiating body who are involved in the talks at Geneva. They said they didn't want to come for exactly the same reason, and that's left just a few other opposition bodies who are maybe smaller, don't have as much of a high profile as the HNC, and therefore maybe not as much clout in these talks.
Andrew Hopkins in Sochi, thank you very much indeed, Andrew. OK, let's speak to Sergei Makarov and Yahya al-Aridi. Thank you for your time, gentlemen. Sergei Makarov, how can these peace talks be taking place in Sochi while the regime in Syria is carrying out airstrikes and killing people, and just the latest example involving Syrian regime planes, because as you well know, over the past few weeks, Russian planes have also been involved in airstrikes?
where you took this propagandistic tone. Maybe it's your question too propagandistic. Let's talk more politically neutrally, and I will try to explain the political logic of what's happening. We have Geneva talks, which is supported by United Nations as major track of the peace negotiation for the Syria, for the transformation from the civil war to the peaceful life and political process and political discussion. It's Geneva, it's number one. But Geneva talks have been blocked by Saudi Arabia and United States. And because Saudi Arabia and United States still dream to support on puppets in Syria to fight against Bashar Assad. In such conditions, when Daesh have been crushed and Jabhat al-Nusra, another terroristic organization, also have been limited, now we have a good chance to move step by step to the peace negotiation. And Russia decided, okay, if they block Geneva talks, let's try another talk. First, they started in Astana about peaceful process. Now they decided maybe to involve not representative political forces, but representatives of the different regional, ethnical, and religious community of Syria, which is invited to this Syrian Congress. It means that if Geneva talks will go forward, main decision will be made on those Geneva chiefs. But if United States and Saudi Arabia will continue to block Geneva talks, a peaceful process in Sochi will be a priority.
Okay. Yahya Al-Aridi, what do you make of that? First of all, do you believe, like Sergei has said to me, that it's propaganda to suggest it's a little bit strange that peace talks are taking place while there are airstrikes going on inside Syria? And also, do you agree with Sergei Markov that the United States and Saudi Arabia are trying to derail the Geneva talks and that therefore, as Sergei says, Russia is taking the lead and holding talks with initiatives in other parts of the world, namely Astana and Sochi?
Well, when something doesn't go along with your logic and you automatically resort to labeling it as propaganda, well, there is a real problem in logic itself here. Syria has been suffering for 7 continuous years of the regime's brutality because basically people rose against a brutal dictatorship and they were faced with bullets. And they got the support of the militias, Hezbollah militias. Then the Iranian Republican Guard came to the rescue. And those said it, Hezbollah said it, and Iran said it, had it not been for us, the regime would have fallen. And all that just also continued not to succeed against the people. Then came the Russian interference in 2016, and Mr. Putin said in 3 months' time he would just finish this whole thing. Until now, still Russian airplanes are bombarding civilian areas and supporting the regime with its brutality against people. There are certain Security Council resolutions, starting with the Geneva Communique of 2012 and then 2254, which talks about a political transition, a transitional governing body. Russia tried all along to discredit the opposition, which represents the people, not by elections, but those people who just wanted to just voice the opposition and say, talk on the part of the masses, the people. Now, in 2254, there is something called ceasefire. And Russia just condensed that into Astana and turned that into de-escalation zones. And these de-escalation zones are breached on a daily basis, not only by the regime, but by Iran and by Russia itself, which is the guarantor. Then selectively, it wanted to talk about a dialogue in Sochi, a Syrian national dialogue. How could you make a dialogue in 6 hours, which were interrupted frequently, those 6 hours, or by 1,200 people so far in Sochi? If one breathes normally or sneezes, the 6 hours would be finished. Now, The HNC or SNC, the Syrian Negotiating Committee, tried in a marathonic way in Vienna for 2 continuous days with the UN, with the Russians, and previously, 3 days ago, 3 days before that, it went to Moscow, and we sat there, we talked with Lavrov about possibilities of finding a peaceful solution for Syria. And we felt that we convinced the man for the first time, face to face, that we really wanted peace. And we would go anywhere in the world in order to find a solution for our people that have been suffering all this time. And the road to finding peace is not through Sochi this way, because that idea of dialogue was selectively picked up from 2254, and which is supposedly to be carried out by the TGB, Transitional Governing Body. Now, all this thing happening, and we felt that the road to finding peace to Syria is not through Sochi. And it is, we felt, really, and we can prove that, such a gathering, which is not opposition, which people who are completely supportive of this brutal regime. They would say, we sacrifice our souls for your sake, Assad. That's what they are saying in Sochi. Is this the way to find peace? Now, one final thing I want to say is that our feeling is that this conference is to legitimize the Assad regime. That's for one thing. Another thing is to say that the Russian military presence in Syria is also legitimate. Now, Russia says it is legitimate because it's invited by a legitimate government. You cannot be legitimate when you kill your people.
Okay, Sergei and Yahya, it seems that in your disagreements, in your opening statements, that you have raised a number of extremely important issues which we have to break down here a little bit. Let's start with going backwards. Astana. Sergei, Yahya has just said, and it's proven, it's there in black and white, that the de-escalation zones have not exactly been successful, with Russia and Iran being the guarantors. Clearly, Turkey is also involved, but no one's accusing Turkey of breaking the rules in the de-escalation zones. There is evidence. People have died. It's well documented. The Astana process in terms of the de-escalation zones, that has not been successful. Can you agree with that?
Not entirely. Of course, de-escalation zone not entirely work correctly, but also they work in big part. You know, it's impossible during the civil war to jump from the civil war to the peace when everybody will respect the stopping of the struggle. No, it should be made step by step. It should be parallel, working more and more for the de-escalation zone to work more properly, and same time to work about political process. And, you know, I want to ask you, if you want now to move political process with a temporary government without Bashar Assad, it's impossible. He is the winner. You have to respect this. And but the government to which we could go should be coalition government, which can include different political forces. And now in Sochi they discuss new Syrian constitution. I think Syria needs constitution not authoritarian, but more look like Lebanon, when all major religious ethnic groups will be represented in the government and the parliament, and will be sure about their right to be respected on the top Damascus level.
Okay, so Yahya, that's the Russian government position, is it not, that the future of Syria should include Bashar al-Assad? What is the HNC position here? Is it still that Bashar al-Assad has to go before any future is found?
Well, this is a pretext being used by Russia when we had the Riyadh communique, which talked about unconditional negotiations in Geneva. And we went there wholeheartedly to talk without preconditions, as Russia wanted. All along, Russia tried to discredit their position because it is fragmented and it is just making preconditions. We said we don't want preconditions, but please forgive us for having a goal. that this person who was the cause for Syria suffering all this time cannot be there. I tell you that Russia itself cannot help, cannot keep, cannot protect, cannot continue supporting this brutal dictatorship for a long time. Russia is being hurt now. What does it mean to use the veto 11 times to protect the brutal regime? Used chemical weapons. And in Syria, there is no civil war as it is being propagandized by others. People rose against dictatorship, simply that. And the problem, when you gather this number of people in Sochi, you feel that the problem is among those people. The problem is not among those people. The problem is among those people and a brutal regime in the first place. Now, Geneva is the track for finding peace. It takes just one little thing, and Russia can do it. That's if it wants. They have to pressure this regime that they are responsible for keeping it there in order to get involved in the political process, in negotiations. So far, they haven't been doing it. We don't know whether it is their will that they do not want, or they cannot. It seems that at certain points they cannot, because Iran is there and it has its plan, its vicious and cunning plan, in order to control these countries. Iranian officials said it, that we have control over 4 Arab capitals. That's what they said. And they wanted Damascus to be part of it. And the Russians themselves have a problem with the Iranians and with that regime that is supported by other people. It is not the issue of Saudi Arabia and America, and when my friend Sergei said at the beginning. It's not that. It is now, have Saudis been killing Syrians? Have Americans been killing Syrians? Well, who is killing Syrians are the regime itself. Iran, the militias, and 83 militias from different parts of the world. They were brought into into Syria. And Russia itself, Putin said that we tried over 200 kinds of weapons in Syria.
Okay, yeah. You're talking to us here in the TRT World Studio. Why are you not in Sochi saying what you're saying here at that conference?
Well, the problem is not with those 1,200 or 1,700 people. Our problem as opposition is not amongst ourselves. Our basic problem is with that regime being supported by Iran, by the different militias, and by Russia. We wanted Russia to have a real responsibility towards the people, not a gang that just gave it permission to have military bases there. We as people, 23 million people, are more important than 1,000 people who are just doing all these things. Why we are not there? One thing is that we believe that Sochi is not the road to finding peace for Syria. Another thing, we feel that Sochi is to legitimize this dictatorship and continue to be brutalizing people because it has been living on tension. A third thing is that it could be legitimizing what may be called by many people Russian occupation of Syria. And a third thing, there is no way to dialogue here. There is no way to talk to one another. How could you, for instance, have a national dialogue by 1,700 people? If this is a representation of different components of the Syrian society, you should have the 23 million people. Half of them were displaced by the regime, and half of them inside. You could have brought them all to Russia so that they can be represented. They cannot be represented, and they don't have any legitimacy at all. That's why we didn't go.
Sergei, if the discussion that's happening here right now is the discussion that, let's say, symbolizes a discussion between the one side that supports the regime of Bashar al-Assad and the other side, his opponents, this isn't going anywhere. Whether it's in Sochi, Vienna, Geneva, Astana, it doesn't matter. It appears as if it's going nowhere. How do you gain the trust of the opposition? Presumably, Bashar al-Assad's forces need that trust before any progress can be made.
I think that Bashar al-Assad also understands that he couldn't be just a winner as a Roman imperator who just will dictate to everybody. He understands very well that different political forces should be included in the new peaceful coalition government. And also, we, as Russia, invited different political forces to take part in this negotiation peace process. And you could see that those who protested against Sergei Lavrov, it looked like they are against Russia, they are against Bashar Assad. And it means that in Sochi we have brought representation of the different political forces. But if somebody like our friend Yaya wants to take part in the peaceful negotiation on the base that Bashar Assad should leave and Russia should withdraw from Russia, it's impossible because, you know, Russia is winner and Bashar Assad also winner. You cannot give up winners. But who really blocks those negotiations? Saudi Arabia and United States. If political forces will be independent on Saudi Arabia and United States and will go to the Syrian people and ask them, you want to continue civil war or you want to stop it and to move to the peaceful transformation? They will say, oh, please, Mr. Yahya, go to the peace. We want coalition government. We want representation of the different religious ethnic groups. And we don't want Saudi Arabia. And as a result, it will be realistic negotiation. If political forces wanted to take part in negotiations on this base, then they will take part in those negotiations. If political forces don't want, communities from Syria will decide themselves, and those political forces will be marginalized.
Sergei Markov, Yahya Al-Aridi, both of you, thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us on the Newsmakers. Coming up, the African Union holds its annual summit, but are its members too corrupt to be effective? And from Prime Minister to convict to a possible political comeback, we look at how Silvio Berlusconi could once again become the Prime Minister of Italy. Welcome back to the Newsmakers. At the African Union's annual summit, the continent's leaders have discussed tackling one of the biggest barriers to development and effective governance: corruption. The organization's incoming chairman is the president of Rwanda, and Paul Kagame has grand plans to reform the regional body. Adil Halim has more.
It's no longer business as usual in Africa. That's the message from Paul Kagame as he begins his African Union chairmanship. The continent has long been accused of being paralyzed by corruption, something the Rwandan president promises to tackle.
It's a bad thing. It has gone too far. It has cost us a lot. But please understand that corruption is not an African thing. It's a global problem.
Leaders from the 55 member states met in Ethiopia's capital, Addis Ababa, to figure out how to reform the AU. High on the agenda, shedding its reputation of being ineffective. Critics say decisions are made, but rarely implemented. Last year, the union agreed reform was necessary. In 2015, nearly 3/4 of its operational budget came from outside the continent, from the European Union and the United States. To change this, member states agreed to pay a 0.2% levy on certain imports. 20 countries have signed on, but there's a roadblock. The Economic Community of West African States already has an import levy in place, so those 15 countries may be reluctant to impose any more. Meanwhile, the two-day summit saw thinly veiled shots aimed at U.S. President Donald Trump's recent derogatory comments towards some African countries.
The rise of national egoism, the triggering of xenophobia, and the rejection of the other are all significant symptoms and signals as if the values of solidarity, equality, and justice are receding. Humanity is at stake.
Also at stake, regional security. Faki said the time has come to impose sanctions on South Sudan if warring factions fail to come up with a peace agreement. That was echoed by the UN Secretary General, who is trying to strengthen ties between the AU and UN.
We believe in African-led solutions for African problems.
The 4-year civil war there has led to tens of thousands dying and nearly 4 million South Sudanese being driven from their homes. So is this the new face of the African Union, a unified front that swiftly addresses financial and security challenges? Or is time running out on this symbol of African unity, one of bold promises, but short of major achievements? Adil Halim, The Newsmakers.
To discuss this, I'm joined from Addis Ababa by Alfred Dube. He's the director of the Institute for Security Studies and also a former diplomat for Botswana. Martin Plaut is also with us, senior research fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies at the University of London. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for joining us on The Newsmakers. Alfred Dube, is the African Union the best that Africa can do, or is it the best that Africa can hope for?
The African Union is the only continental intergovernmental organization. I think every member state hopes they can use it as a platform to achieve all their ambitions for African unity and African development. So the African Union, as is now, is what they hope they can build to achieve those strategies. But what it is, it's an organization of member states, and therefore it will achieve, its achievements will entirely depend on how its members can collaborate to achieve their goals.
Martin Plaut, is it an effective umbrella body for the continent, or do you feel its failings are greater than its achievements?
Well, I remember the hopes of the Organization of African Unity, which was its predecessor until 2001, from the 1970s, late 1960s onwards. And, you know, there was this great hope that it would unite Africa and bring about the sort of dream of Pan-Africanism that people like Kwame Nkrumah had put forward in that period. And quite frankly, it just hasn't done that. Now, that's not to suggest it hasn't done a lot. I mean, its first objective was to get rid of white minority rule in places like Rhodesia in South Africa, get rid of the Portuguese colonies in Mozambique and Angola. That it's certainly achieved. But the other aims, the Pan-African dream, the peace, the coordination, that I'm afraid it has not done.
Martin, I'm glad you mentioned Pan-Africanism. Ambassador Dube, how relevant is the concept of Pan-Africanism today in 2018? And indeed, is it a good thing?
I think Pan-Africanism was very relevant, as Martin says, at the time of fighting colonialism on this continent. It is still also an ambition that a number of Africans aspire to, simply because of the successes of that time. It brought Africans from all kinds of creeds and from various regions of the continent together to fight for one common cause. Now, our big common cause today is alleviation of poverty, peace and security on the continent. If we could have the same spirit of Pan-Africanism to tackle these very, very difficult issues today, which I have to say we have, Africa has not really reached or even achieved the level of collaboration in that regard, which they should have done before. Then indeed, you know, if we could find the same spirit of Pan-Africanism to move towards that direction, we would be moving quite far. At this stage, I agree with Martin, we have not achieved very much in that regard. But as a slogan, as a hope for Africa, I think Pan-Africanism still has a meaning in our development, in our political development, in peace and security.
Martin, if it's peace and security and alleviating poverty, which are the aims, the new chairman of the African Union, Paul Kagame, he wants to introduce some pretty radical reforms. Are any of those reforms designed specifically to address those two issues?
Well, one of the things he's put forward is that Africa should stand on its own feet. For example, he said there should be a 0.2 5% tax on imports from outside Africa so that Africa can finance itself. I mean, it's one of the great ironies that Africa, which has huge riches and whose leaders, and here I do not include Botswana, Ambassador Dube's country in this, you know, some of whose leaders have salted away hundreds of millions of dollars in Swiss bank accounts and the Cayman Islands and God knows where. You know, really Africa has to first stand on its own 2 feet and unite. And you know, there are all sorts of things it can do. I mean, for example, if there was a cut in the many tariffs and border controls that are put up all across the continent to prevent, say, a Ghanaian exporting to Nigeria. I mean, how many roadblocks do they have to go through? It's appalling. Now, you know, Southern Africa has done quite a good job in this respect. But, you know, parts of West Africa, Central Africa are just atrocious. And there's a long way to go in this respect. But, you know, Africa has made a lot of progress, but, you know, there's just such a long way to go still.
Ambassador Dube, if it's so obvious to a neutral observer, albeit an extremely seasoned observer and analyst like Martin Plaut, why is it not obvious to the leaders of Africa that this is just one of the issues that they need to address, breaking down those tariff barriers?
Well, I mean, Martin is quite right. This is really a task that every African leader should really aspire to, because until we break those barriers, Agenda 2063, which is, you know, adopted a few years ago by the same heads of government, cannot be achieved. We have to break those barriers. We have to understand that global trade and the flow of financial flows is a reality in the world. You cannot be isolated in the African continent away from the rest of the world. We cannot be isolated from each other. It is it really cannot work anymore. If you are in the ECOWAS region, you should be able to move seamlessly, certainly in terms of movement of goods, without too many, you know, customs barriers and controls that make it so difficult to do so. But it's the same whether you're in the south or the west or the east. Africa must move towards that goal. I agree completely.
Okay, let's imagine in an ideal world, in a fantasy land, that all of Africa, the entire continent, is a free trade area. If corruption exists at the level that it does today, surely that would just negate every advantage that such a fantasy world of free trade would provide. You guys know the figures yourselves, but the viewers may not know them. The Economic Commission for Africa says that every year the continent loses more than $148 billion because of various corrupt activities. The AU Commission chairperson opened the AU summit in Addis Ababa by saying the year 2018 is called to be the year of the battle against corruption, and crucial decisions will be taken here at the summit, whose highlight is institutional reform. Is it really going to happen? The rest of the world looks at Africa, and one of the first words it thinks of is corruption. Ambassador?
Well, corruption on this continent, and indeed, of course, corruption around the world, is one of the biggest challenges. Yes, you have this year, the African Union at this summit adopted the theme of fighting corruption. We all know what is happening on the ground. You've just referred to it yourself, and the cost of corruption on this continent. It's massive. It is not, I think it's a hope that we can collectively fight corruption, but really corruption starts from the domestic before you even get in the regional area rather than before you even get to the continent. But it is not going to be easy. There must be no illusions that we can eradicate or even fight corruption 20% in the next 2 years or 5 years. So that is, I think, again, another wish, another aim, because we all believe, I think we all understand that corruption has really sapped the energy and the effectiveness of our governance and our institutions just through corruption. It's cost us a hell of a lot. And it is time that Africa, our leaders, begin to really understand that without, again, tackling corruption at whatever level, this continent, all our hopes and our dreams will be sacrificed at the altar of corruption.
Noble words, Ambassador. Martin, what about concrete action against corruption?
I mean, that's what's required. And one of the problems is that the people who are sitting around that table are themselves, shall we say, have less than clean hands. I mean, you get someone like Emmerson Mnangagwa, the new president of Zimbabwe. I mean, he was named in a United Nations report of having been part of a syndicate that took billions out of the Congo during the Congo War, and that he then established a syndicate inside Zimbabwe. Now, I mean, you know, he has to answer the questions about those. You have people like President Zuma in South Africa, again, named in over, 400 more cases against him in South Africa. How can you expect people like that to implement an anti-corruption drive when they themselves are facing the issues? But, you know, I don't want to just sort of bang on about Africa and corruption. There's much more to Africa than that, many positive things coming. And the other thing that one has to never forget is that it takes two to tango. It takes the Western countries which are involved in quite a lot of the corruption, some of which is sanctioned by states, and, you know, a lot of the tax havens are run, for example, from Britain. So, I mean, you know, that is where the money is hidden away. You know, there are all sorts of people who have dirty hands, and, you know, really they have to, shall we say, step up to the plate. Africa has the right to call on the international community to support its efforts. That is absolutely legitimate. But at the end of the day, it's Africa that must solve this problem.
How does Africa solve the problem, if indeed it's a problem, of longevity of service? The longer generally a leader will be in power, it doesn't matter where you are in the world, systems of patronage become entrenched, and the elite that benefits from that leader's patronage, they have a self-interest in maintaining the status quo. Let me again, for the benefit of the viewers, give you a few leaders around Africa and how long they've been in power. Biya in Cameroon, 42 years. Nguesso in Republic of Congo, 33 years. Museveni in Uganda, 32 years. Al-Bashir in Sudan, 28 years. Deby in Chad, 27 years. Afwerki in Eritrea, 26 years. Kagame in Rwanda, 23 years. That can't be a good thing. Martin?
Well, I agree. I mean, you know, the greatest present that President Mandela gave to South Africa was saying after the end of one term, and he was a stellar leader, he said, I've done my bit, I'm retiring. It was the greatest present because nobody can ever now turn around in South Africa and say, well, you know, you really need me, you can't get by without me. These people should hand over. And, you know, you mentioned Museveni in Uganda. I was in Uganda a few days after he took power. And I remember him saying that the African Union, or the Organization of African Unity, as it was then called, was a club of dictators. Well, he's certainly joined the club.
Ambassador, what do you feel about longevity of service? Does it suppress true democracy? Is it a problem for Africa that many of these leaders simply don't leave?
Oh, it is a problem. It is a major problem. You cannot, I just cannot understand how, first of all, it's hard enough having 2 terms running a country as a leader. You know, to be 40 years at the helm of a country with very little change in terms of the kind of leadership or support, the kind of cabinet, your senior officials with very little change, because what it breeds, what actually longevity breeds is also you have the same people over and over again, even well beyond the age of 60, because those are the people you trust, those are the people you control. Longevity of governance, I mean, that kind of governance, that kind of leadership cannot be good for Africa at all.
Martin, you mentioned financing. Sorry for interrupting you, Ambassador. Martin, you mentioned financing. The AU wants to finance itself. Is that realistic? There are some countries who say, look, we make up so much of Africa's overall GDP. If you give a particular percentage to every member state that it has to contribute, we, those richer nations, will have to contribute too much. There could be a problem there.
Well, it could be a problem, but, you know, at the end of the day, Africa has many resources. You know, you can't go relying on other people forever. I mean, I don't know if you saw the story today that the African Union is in a building which was built for it kindly by the Chinese. And today it's been revealed, guess what they did? They put bugging devices inside so that all the communications of the African Union are transmitted back to China. Well, that's what happens when you get gifts. But you know, I think it's a pity that we always bang on about the bad things about Africa. Africa has a young and dynamic group of people, particularly the young businessmen whom I've met up and down the continent, who are bringing new life and vigor to the continent and have fantastic ideas and who know exactly what the problems are, but they are determined to make a success of their countries and a success of the continent. And I have absolutely no doubt that in due course, Africa will be one of the shining lights of the world. I remember very well when China was written off as a basket case. Who would do that today?
Sure, and I must say that China does deny those allegations of bugging the AU's head offices, Martin. Ambassador, let's end with you. The African Union has asked President Donald Trump for an apology after he used foul language to describe Africa as a continent and the individual countries that make up Africa. Do you think that the African Union will get an apology that it wants? And if it doesn't, does it matter, really?
Well, I think, I believe very strongly that President Trump, as the leader of as the leader of the United States, a superpower, should not be at all, whatever what may have got to him, can never use language like that to talk about other countries and the very countries which are of particular importance even to the United States. He must apologize. He can say he didn't say it. He can refuse to apologize, but he must understand that by saying what he said, he's, in our eyes, in the eyes of Africans, young and old, he cannot be a friend. The United States has a responsibility as a global power. The President of the United States holds that responsibility. And he cannot just think he can say such insulting words and it's nothing to Africa, or even to the world for that matter. I mean, it's not even for Africans only. I think President Trump should step up to the plate. He should be brave enough to stand up, face us and say, guys, I made a mistake, I'm sorry. That's what he should do.
Ambassador Alfred Dubé and Martin Plaut, thank you for joining us on The Newsmakers.
He's the reassuring second hand, an old car that often didn't work well, but that you know. And in the current situation, which is a very uncertain situation, and without strong alternatives, the old thing that didn't work the best way, but that you know, for many people, is something reassuring.
Silvio Berlusconi is back. 6 years after resigning as Italy's Prime Minister, the flamboyant 81-year-old media mogul is again at the centre of Italian politics. Berlusconi has been in Brussels to introduce himself to EU lawmakers as the saviour of European populism. His political party, Forza Italia, in partnership with two right-wing groups, is tipped to win the Italian elections in March. And depending on whether he can overturn a ban on holding office, Berlusconi could become the next Prime Minister or, at the very least, be the power behind the throne. For more on this, let's talk to Michael Day, who's in London. Michael is the author of Being Berlusconi, The Rise and Fall from Cosa Nostra to Bunga Bunga. Michael, thank you very much indeed for joining us on The Newsmakers. The title of your book, it suggests some of what Silvio Berlusconi is well known for, but there's also those public gaffes, the way he would embarrass Italians. You remember when he said that President Barack Obama had a nice tan. All of this that you've written about in the book and everything many people make fun of him for, is he still the same or has he changed?
I don't think he'll ever change. I mean, I think we know what he's like. People know what he's like. The big question is, how is it possible he might, as you've just said, about to be a very, very important figure in Italian politics again? You've heard about this trial. We've heard about there's a new Bunga Bunga trial, related trial, in which he is accused of bribing witnesses to cover up the sex parties, but despite all that, he might well have a very important role in government. And I think it's a question of people in Italy, the poverty of choice is such that some people are thinking it's better the devil we know. Incredible as that might seem to people not in Italy.
Yes, that case that you mentioned, the bribery case, that's just the latest, isn't it? He's been investigated for business deals, having links to the mafia, holding those sex parties, as you described them, paying these bribes, one apparent alleged bribe to a pianist at the sex party so that he would give a particular version of events that would make Berlusconi look better. How does a man like this still hold the attention of the Italian people and make them want to vote for him?
Well, as I said, it's partly... I mean, one thing I would say, comparisons have been made between Donald Trump and Berlusconi. Berlusconi is not Donald Trump, despite lots of things they have in common. They're both vulgar, they're both dishonest, they're both very rich. But Berlusconi actually has a certain charm. I know he's vulgar, he's rude, he's a liar, he's a criminal, but he's also quite funny. I mean, some people actually, and this is hard to appreciate, but some people in Italy actually quite like him. There's kind of a vicarious thrill when you see someone, a short, unexceptional-looking person, going from one helicopter, by a helicopter from one luxury villa to another luxury villa to have sex with lots of young women. Some people probably think, my good on him, isn't it? You know, it's wrong, but it's quite funny. I wish it were me. That's part of it. The other part, I think, is that the political situation in Italy is such there is not much choice. The left is always divided and hopeless. The centre ground is weak because I think Renzi, who was going to be the new Tony Blair, gambled on this referendum on rewriting the Constitution. That blew up in his face. So now we've got Berlusconi, and the other alternative is the far right. We have the Lega Nord, the Northern League, which is essentially a racist party. And Berlusconi is now able to present himself as the voice of reason. He can say, well, I can actually control the Northern League. I promise not to ditch the euro. And I'm the person, I am effectively the moderate voice of populism. That's how he's selling himself. I mean, look, I don't think he's going to be Prime Minister again. He's too old. He's banned because he's a tax fraud. He's gone to the European Court in Strasbourg to actually try and undo that ban. I don't think he will. But in any case, I think it will come too late. It can't come before May. The election is in March. So if the centre-right does win, has a majority coalition, he probably will be a force from behind the scenes. And given the fact that, as you say, he's a convicted criminal and he's 81, that's quite impressive, isn't it? And quite mind-boggling for lots of your viewers, I would imagine.
Yes, well, that ban handed down by Italian lawmakers, that anyway expires in 2019. So what could possibly happen then, we'll wait and see. You mentioned his age. Why would an 81-year-old with all the money in the world, having been Prime Minister 3 times before, want to come back into Italian politics? Some people say he wants revenge. Could that be his motivation?
I think it's a mixture of things. That's a good question, but I mean, he's got all the money in the world. Why doesn't he just spend the rest of his days like Tiberius in a villa, having grapes peeled and people feeding him with? I don't know. I mean, I think partly it's ego. He thinks he should be Prime Minister. Also, certainly in the recent past, there's an element of him being protected, because if he is Prime Minister then, or a Member of Parliament, certainly he has a large degree of protection from prosecution. That's another part or aspect of it. And I think he just likes the attention as well. He thinks he should be Prime Minister. He thinks he can do it better than anyone else. I think he likes to delude himself that he actually believes he is one of Europe's elder statesmen and not just a sort of dirty old sleaze who's evaded his taxes. Maybe he's a bit of both. That's the fascination of Silvio Berlusconi, really, isn't it?
Yes, well, as you know, the slogan of his political party, the name of his political party, is a football chant. Forza Italia. How could you not agree with Forza Italia? Go Italy. You take pride in your nation. And having been there to Brussels to announce himself as the saviour of European populism, he did meet some very important people there, including Jean-Claude Juncker, Michel Barnier, people who are very, very heavily involved in European politics. So he clearly still has influence.
I think so. I mean, well, he has influence in the... I mean, they all hate him, and I think he's ridiculous and it's embarrassing. But to some extent, I mean, Italy can say that Italy is an important member of the EU. With Britain leaving, the EU has to be united. It's got problem with Eastern Europe and the Central European countries, which are behaving in a very undemocratic way. It's important that France, Germany, Spain, Italy stick together. They need Italy on board. They need an Italy which is not going to ditch the euro. Silvio Berlusconi has gone over there to say, well, if we win, don't worry, we're not going to do anything very Eurosceptic. But equally, I think Italy has a case to complain. I mean, look, it's been left in the lurch with the migration crisis for so long. The other countries were not helping it at all. It has a very porous southern border. It was having tens of thousands of migrants, and the rest of Europe did not want to know. And that, in part, has actually fueled the rise of the right in Italy. And so I think the powers that be in Brussels, they know that Italy has a case, and they have to listen to them. And they probably are aware that's what's fueled the populism in Italy. So I think they will have to be accommodating of Italy. And they have, you know, they can, to some extent, Europe can say it's brought this upon itself, I think.
Michael, what was the reaction to your book in Italy, and what did that tell you about the popularity of Silvio Berlusconi? Did he at all threaten to take you to court? Did people say that it's just a character assassination?
They loved it. They thought it was funny and spot on, slightly immodest. I'm being immodest like Silvio Berlusconi. But I think English people were slightly irreverent. And the things that he's got away with, he could not have gotten away with a fraction, 1/100th of this in the UK. And I think I wrote it from that perspective as an Anglo-Saxon who lived there for 8 years and couldn't believe what I was seeing.
Michael Day, we appreciate it. Thank you for joining us on The Newsmakers. That's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Adnan Nawaz. Do check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, Donald Trump makes his first State of the Union address as President of the United States. We'll debate the impact of the speech. Until then, thanks for watching. Goodbye.